Greetings, my name is Dar Roberts. I am pleased to introduce a series of short flash talks that feature wildfire-related research at UCSB. This set of talks is part of the Wildfire Prevention and Policy Lecture Series and is kindly being hosted by the Fire Safe Council as part of the Wildfire Preparedness Exposition. Topics included in the talks are designed to highlight the diversity of research at UCSB, including fire ecology, fire weather and ignitions, fire behavior, remote sensing, economics and insurance, and risk management. I hope you enjoyed them. Greetings, my name is Dar Roberts. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, where I've been since 1994, and my specialty is remote sensing. This is a technology that is widely used in the fire community. There are a variety of ways it is used. One of the critical ways is to tell us something about the kinds of fuels across the landscape. We call that pre-fire fuels. It's also used to tell us something about the immediacy of fire danger, what would happen if a fire were to ignite. Would it spread widely? Would it be easy to put out? It tells us something about active fire properties, most critically the temperature of fires and where fires are burning. This is tied to emissions such as smoke. It's used to tell us something about severity. This is the ecological impact of a fire. And finally, it tells us something about post-fire recovery, what comes back after a fire is burned. And in this talk, I will only talk about the first bullet. So one of the critical things remote sensing tells us is what kind of fuels are across the landscape. And so fuels are the material that burns. And then for us, we live in a landscape composed mostly of shrublands called hard chaparral, shown on the right, and soft chaparral, shown below. This is chamise and big pod ceanothus, and this is California sagebrush. And what we're showing here now is a map of the Santa Barbara area, and we can see up in the upper front range, the pink stuff is the chamise. The greener materials are the big pod ceanothus. So this tells us if a fire were to ignite, what might be burning. Another critical component is what we call fuel condition. This is a measure of the live to dead components. And in this case, the lower the ratio, the more dead components, the more dangerous the conditions. For this, we use a mixing model where we unmix a mixed pixel into measures of live material, dead material, and soil. In this case, red is non-photosynthetic vegetation or dead material. GV is green. This is the average conditions. So chaparral again shows up as slightly red here, telling us the fuel condition naturally is not as good versus the moisture vegetation shown here. And then we're showing how it varies across years. And so what you're seeing here is 2016 in red, 2010 in green, and 1995 in blue. These are the Gap and Jesucita fires shown here, telling us that these were areas that burned, leaving behind and dead material. And then the blood red conditions here tells us the fuel conditions are very, very poor in 2016. And then finally, the last thing I'll talk about is live fuel moisture. This is a measure of how much moisture is present in a plant. And essentially, the more moisture, the less likely the fire is to ignite and then burn across the landscape. And we can use remote sensing to tell us the general live fuel moisture. A critical level is below 60% live fuel moisture when fires are likely to get very extreme. And what we're showing here is Los Angeles County between 2000 and 2006. Red is the critical color, 70, and yellow is also fairly dangerous conditions. So we can see 2002 and 2004 stood out in June 10th as dangerous. As we progress through the dry season and get into August, the entire landscape has dangerous conditions, but still some years are much less so. And so with that, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce you my research.
Hello everyone, today I'll be talking about some research that a few colleagues and I did, looking at identifying drivers of vegetation conversion in Southern California. And so the research that we did was focused primarily on chaparral ecosystems, and these are characterized by evergreen shrubs that form these dense closed canopies like seen here. And these shrublands are adapted to Mediterranean climates, characterized by hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. And then they're also fire adapted to the historic fire regime in Southern California of high intensity crown fires burning through the area every 25 to 100 plus years. However, there's been growing instances of type conversion of chaparral to non-native grasslands. And this is of concern because there's not only a loss of native biodiversity, but also a loss of important ecosystem services that chaparral provides, such as slope stabilization, habitat for animals and vertebrates, and carbon sequestration. And there's been many potential drivers identified at the plot level, like shortening fire return intervals, drought, and site aridity. But the research that we did really wanted to focus on identifying drivers at larger spatial scales. And so our research is focused on the 2003 Piru fire scar that's almost directly inland of Santa Barbara and northwest of Los Angeles. And we used 1930 historic aerial imagery and then more recent 2009 imagery to identify vegetation fluxes in this area. And our research sought to answer three main questions. The first being, how widespread is chaparral conversion to grass at a larger spatial scale? What is driving any observed conversion that we see? And how are different variables potentially interacting to drive that conversion? And so as far as the vegetation fluxes that we saw, we can see that in 1930, there is widespread dominance of chaparral in the area. By 2009, there's fairly substantial conversion to grasslands, leading to grasslands being almost equal in dominance to chaparral. And the drivers that we identified for this conversion, with this graph here showing variable importance and variables higher up on the y-axis being more important, we can see the southwest mist with more southwest facing slopes generally being more exposed to sunlight during the day and more arid year round were more likely to convert. Plots that had less precipitation within the 4 years post-fire also being more likely to convert. And so here we see an interaction between drought and fire. And then plots that had higher grass cover in 1930 were also more likely to convert. And then plots at lower elevation and plots with shorter return intervals. And so here we see kind of this expected higher frequency of fire leading to chaparral conversion as well. And so going back to our questions, we can see that we did indeed observe widespread conversion of chaparral to non-native grasslands, that the drivers were post-fire drought, site aridity, grass presence, and short interval fires. And then we really saw a strong interaction between drought and fire compounding to make conversion more likely. And so we can really summarize our findings with this schematic here, showing that chaparral recovery after fire can be derailed and lead to type conversion by either a high presence of grass pre-fire, leading to pretty immediate conversion post-fire, drought events within the first 4 years of fires, leading to type conversion, or short interval fires within 5 to 7 years after a high intensity crown fire, also leading to conversion. Thank you for your time.
Hi all, I'm Kevin Varga, a PhD student at UCSB in the Geography Department and the treasurer of the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of my research titled Mega Fires in a Warming World: What Wildfire Risk Factors Led to California's Largest Recorded Wildfire. Everyone in California knows that fire activity has been increasing, and sadly, a big part of that is due to us. Climate change is causing a hotter, drier atmosphere, which is drying fuels out, allowing them to burn faster and more intense. Climate change is also contributing to our current mega drought. Our forests are becoming denser due to this mentality that we have to fight fires, and some due to commercial logging. Denser forests is evident in this before and after picture of Yosemite Valley. In order to better understand this, I analyzed the initial explosive growth of the August complex, California's largest recorded wildfire event. It ignited during a dry lightning storm in August of 2020, during an ongoing heat wave and drought, burned over 1 million acres, cost over $115 million and a firefighter's life. I used a fire spread model to simulate the first 4 days of explosive growth of the Doe Fire, the largest individual fire contributing to the August complex. You can see the observed perimeter in the figure here in black and my modeled perimeter in red. I wanted to use this fire spread model to answer some questions like what meteorological and fuel conditions contributed the most to the fire's growth, and how would the Doe fire have evolved if the ignition had occurred during a second stronger heat wave in September 2020. Within the control model, the main fuels were shrubs, represented by SH here in this figure, as well as timber, represented by TL and TU. These fire spread models allow us to temporally and spatially analyze the rate of spread, or ROS, as well as the total fuel consumption, or TFC. When looking at different factors that contributed to the rate of spread in a principal component analysis, I realized that hot and dry daytime temperatures were the main contributors. There were some gusty southerly winds during the day, but this fire was mostly driven by hot, dry conditions, causing sometimes over 4,000 acres of growth per hour. After completing the control simulation, I did some experiments with the model, plugging in historical climate values or perturbing the temperature. The greatest results occurred whenever I set the fuel moisture content to historical 90th percentile values. This caused an 18% greater growth. Whenever I set the ignition to August 5th, which was before the ongoing heat wave, the fire grew less than 50% of its observed growth. And when I set the ignition to September 6th, a hotter heat wave, fire grew more than 50% greater. This shows that extreme events like heat waves and droughts, which are becoming more likely with climate change, can contribute to really extreme fire behavior. When looking at the amount of heat that the fire released, some of the same results occurred. Drier fuels, hotter, drier atmosphere cause greater heat release, which accelerates the combustion process. Hotter, drier conditions into the night are also causing increased fire behavior at night, when firefighters typically can do more containment or get some well-needed rest. This does not bode well for our hotter, drier future. Thank you all for listening. I'm going to end with a picture of myself when I was a wildland firefighter and direct any questions to my email, kvarga@ucsb.edu.
All right, hello and welcome. And today I'm going to be talking to you about our lab's work on landscaping flammability in Santa Barbara's wildland urban interface. So first I'm going to introduce our team. So I am Christina Faust, and our other two grad students are Robert Fitch and Indra Boving, and our undergraduate is Joe Celebrezzi. Our community partner for this project is the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. Our project advisor is Dr. Max Moritz, and initial funding for this project came from the Wonder Labs organization. So again, today I'll be going through wildfire in Santa Barbara County very briefly, defensible space, living with fire and our project goals, and the next steps for this project. This is showing areas of high fire risk in Santa Barbara County. And you may have heard of this term called a wildland urban interface, and that's where communities in Santa Barbara County start blending into native vegetation. And often these WUI communities occur in areas of high fire risk. So there are 26 communities at risk in Santa Barbara County. So in response to that, the county has come out with this idea of defensible space that you are probably very familiar with by now. And this is looking at your property and how you can manage the vegetation around your home to protect your home from wildfire. And ultimately, this has led into this idea of fire-safe plants. And what our group is doing is we are looking at this idea of fire-safe plants and asking the question if there are actually plants that can be labeled as fire-safe, or if we need to be thinking more about maintenance and watering and spacing. So next we have this figure looking at understanding human relationships with fire. And going through this, our project goals come out of this idea. So our first goal is to identify plants used in landscaping in the wildland-urban interface. Then we're going to look at how people value and engage with these plants. And then we're going to test these plants for their flammability characteristics, and then give that information back to the community, mostly through the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, but we are always looking for ways to kind of directly interact with our neighbors and everybody who lives out here about these topics. So first we're looking at this plant selection process. So this is how we chose the plants to test in our study. So we did this community survey where we had written responses and photos, and then consulted with the Botanic Garden to narrow down all of those great responses into a final list for testing. And out of that came 10 plants that we will ultimately put through flammability testing, including California sagebrush, coastal live oak, swan's neck agave, and Howard McMinn manzanita. And then our goal too was to look at how people value and use the plants in their landscaping. And we found that most people in Santa Barbara County value their plants from a cultural or a regulating perspective. So our third goal is to actually test these plants for flammability. And here are just a couple of figures or pictures of our flammability test chamber that we will use to test these plants. And very exciting, in this new round of testing, we will be collecting heat flux information and information about the smoke that comes off of these burning plants. And the first round we'll be looking at is well-watered plants, and we will compare that to droughted plants. So looking at the difference between plants that are well-maintained and well taken care of and plants that are dry and crispy, and see how that varies across these different species. So in conclusion, our next steps are to actually do this flammability testing. And then very importantly, we want to develop materials to share with the community and promote a two-way community conversation about these topics. What information do people need, and how can we best serve the needs of the community with this research?
Hello, I'm Robert Fitch, a fourth-year PhD student at UCSB. Today, I'm going to be discussing how my dissertation work is trying to understand how native plants can be used to reduce the risk of ignitions in areas prone to ignition, like roadsides. Annual grasses often occur adjacent to roads, and since grasses germinate early in winter, they reproduce and die in spring, meaning that over summer, their dead biomass contains very low moisture. And grass stalks are very fine fuels. Therefore, they can easily ignite by sparks or cigarettes and then quickly spread fire. The U.S. Forest Service maps ignitions across their lands shown here in green, showing the Angeles National Forest and the south end of the Los Padres. Roads are in yellow, and the ignitions are these purple dots. And as we can see, there are many ignitions that occur along the roadways. Major freeways like the 5 and 138 have numerous ignitions all throughout their corridors, and so do many roads that lead inside the forests. In fact, 65% of total ignitions occur within 500 feet of a road. So this is definitely a big issue that we hope to address using my research. For fuel to ignite, the amount of moisture in the fuel is critical. The more water that is contained within the plant parts, the harder it is to ignite. These data are percent live fuel moisture, so the amount of water in plants, looking at 3 different plant communities I'm studying in my research. The red line are annual grasses. The green line is chamise, a common and dominant shrub in the chaparral. And the blue line are native perennial bunch grasses and annual wildflowers, so non-woody vegetation. And as we can see in this graph, that the fuel moisture of annual grasses plummets in spring, meaning that all of that biomass is dead with very little moisture, whereas the native herbaceous community in blue retains living live fuel moisture throughout the summer, meaning it should be more difficult to ignite. And also, it maintains this moisture above this dotted orange line across the bottom, which is the critical threshold for wildfire danger. My research is using experimental plots to see how we could restore roadsides and replace the easily ignitable annual grass vegetation with native vegetation that retains live fuel moisture throughout the summer. As we can see in these photos from my experiment, the non-native grass vegetation has a lot of dead biomass, thatch, and a thick layer of litter, while plots with native species are alive and green and have even spaces between them and bare ground patches, meaning this vegetation type should be harder to ignite as well as be more difficult to spread fire. So this would hopefully reduce the chances of ignitions. And we hope to apply this work at a larger scale in future restoration projects. Thank you for listening.
Welcome. A research focus in my lab is to use ecological principles to explore the restoration of degraded landscapes, including chaparral. And I'd like to give a shout out to my graduate students who have put tremendous energy and creativity into this project. It also offers an opportunity to broaden participation of diverse undergraduate students in the process of research, as well as in the development of relationships with the land. Now, why do we need to do restoration in chaparral? And one of the reasons is that many of the species that are endemic to these chaparral habitats do not regenerate well in the face of altered fire regimes such as we're seeing in Southern California today. In particular, those species that rely on germination from the seed bank after fire to maintain their populations are being driven out of the chaparral environment by short return intervals between fires. So an example of what happens when we have short return intervals can be seen here in Ventura County, where this site used to be dominated by chaparral species and now burned 3 times in less than 20 years and is now dominated by invasive annual grasses. And the result is a landscape dominated by invasive grasses like you see here that is highly ignitable and where there are high rates of soil erosion, poor infiltration during rainfall, low support for pollinators and wildlife, and reduced storage of carbon. The challenge we then face is how to restore biodiversity and ecosystem functioning to these degraded landscapes. And I want to point out that these tend to be very hot, dry parts of the landscape in very steep locations. So the approach that we're taking is to use a diverse mix of species, including classic sage scrub type species and more chaparral type species. Measure a variety of traits, including physiological, morphological, and reproductive traits, and then outplant these species into the landscape. One of the questions we're asking is, does performance of these different plants depend on the traits of the plants themselves or the microhabitat into which they're being planted? And we hypothesize that performance will depend on drought-tolerant traits, and that in fact we'll see better performance by species that are more drought-tolerant. We predict that sage scrub species will generally outperform the more classic chaparral species, particularly in the drier, hotter portions of the landscape, and that they will more quickly suppress the exotic annual grasses in these sites. Another question we're asking is, can these sage scrub species be used as nurse plants, beneath which we could establish more of the chaparral or harder to establish species? And we predict that success will depend on the shade tolerance of the outplanted species. For example, into this supposed nurse plant environment, if we plant species that are light demanding, they might do very poorly. By contrast, It's possible that these nurse plants will only be useful for more shade-tolerant species like toyon or sugarbush. So the reality is likely to be that we won't go back to the chaparral that was once dominating these landscapes, that in fact, if we want to try to restore them, we must go forward to a new community of plants that is likely to survive in the hotter and drier world that we have created. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Claire Psyche, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Santa Barbara. I'm specializing in remote sensing, and my research focuses on remote sensing of wildfire fuels and how fuels relate to the emissions that result from fire. For some background, there are a lot of benefits for using remote sensing and geospatial data to research fire. Remote sensing can help contribute a lot of understanding to the fire community because it provides a timely and large-scale perspective on fire that we cannot gain from anywhere else. This information is quickly translated into actionable information used in modern-day wildfire fighting before, during, and after a fire occurs. And my focus is particularly to quantify the effects of fire on the landscape and atmosphere by looking at what burns or the pre-fire fuels. My research is largely focused on the fuels that burn in a fire or the vegetation on the ground, and especially how they translate to wildfire emissions, which is one of the many aspects of fire that have a major impact on people and the environment. When it comes to our understanding of fire emissions, there is a lot of uncertainty that's caused by how we represent the vegetation that burns or the fuels, and ultimately how fuels themselves impact emissions. So we know that fuels impact fire behavior and consumption, but we want to get a better view of how that comes full circle and contributes to the quantity and composition of the smoke emissions from wildfire. And right now, fuels are contributing up to 80% of the error that we get when trying to quantify emissions from fires, because we represent them in a very regional and homogeneous way that's often not really specific to the actual location of a fire. So my research seeks to address this overarching question of how to reduce uncertainty in our understanding of the composition and strength of fire emissions that result from our representation and understanding of the fuels that burn where a fire burns. To address this problem of how fuels are represented across the landscape, I use airborne and satellite remote sensing data like hyperspectral imagery and light detection and ranging, or LiDAR data, which gives specific information on the chemical and structural characteristics of vegetation to map characteristics of pre-fire fuels where a fire burns. Those fuel maps are then used to understand fire consumption and emissions through models. And as you can see, there are several types of data that I use for the machine learning models to develop fuel characteristics, maps that can be used to estimate emissions to reduce the uncertainty that we have in calculating wildfire emissions. So what I've found is that these models and the subsequent maps that I've produced are accurate. And I'm starting to work on quantifying the differences between the currently used approaches for representing fuels that are used to estimate fire emissions to using variable and locationally specific fuel maps that are produced with this methodology. And it's looking like there is a difference and a greater level of accuracy. So you can see examples of some of these maps on the right here, where each pixel represents unique vegetation characteristics. And the hope here is to continue to evaluate this methodology on different fires that have available data and continue to test the portability of this methodology. The biggest benefits of the fuel mapping methodology that I've produced is that they can be used in place of existing fuel models that are used as input to different emissions and fire consumption models, and especially allow for us to try to quantify better the amount and types of emissions from an individual fire. Also, these maps can stand alone or potentially inform management practices. And there's still so much more that we can discover and investigate here, But looking forward, the infrastructure to use this methodology is growing, which will allow it to be an increasingly accessible approach to representing fuels in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
I'm Naomi Tagg, a professor at UCSB's Bren School for Environmental Science and Management. In my research, I design computer simulation models that provide us insights into what future fire regimes may look like and how those changes are linked to other things we care about, like biodiversity and water supply. The model that I develop and apply, RESIS, integrates our best available science on how different processes work, including the processes that derive fire spread and fire severity, and the timing and of recovery of vegetation after fire, and how all of this is linked to water availability. We do our homework. We evaluate our model by comparing it with observations of stream flow, observations of vegetation growth, like tree ring widths, and observations of carbon and water fluxes. Most importantly, we compare our model estimates with observations of spatial and temporal patterns of burn probability. Once we've done this, we have a virtual laboratory that we can use to ask, what will future fire regimes look like, and how will they be associated with carbon sequestration and water supply? To give you an example, we applied our RESIS model to a watershed in the California Sierras, and we asked, what if the climate warms by 2 degrees? Or what if it warms by 4 degrees? What would happen if the 2010 drought repeated once every decade? What also would happen if we turned off fire suppression? This graph shows some of the results. This is the 10-year mean area burned. We'll notice that area burned increases once we turn off fire suppression, not surprisingly, but it is also higher for those warmer and drier scenarios. Perhaps what's more interesting is in the second and third decade, what we see is that often the warmer and drier scenarios actually have less area burned. And that's because the vegetation or the fuels are growing more slowly due to those dry conditions. We also use our model to ask questions about fuel treatment effectiveness. How does the effectiveness of fuel treatment vary depending on the climate you get after you do the fuel treatment? How does it change with the type of fuel treatment, or with the vegetation species, or where in the watershed you do the fuel treatment? Our model then generates probability distributions that tell us how the effectiveness of fuel treatments on fire risk is likely to vary, what the implications are for carbon cycling and for water supply. Our model can also be used to say what are the most important factors that determine the effectiveness of fuel treatments for reducing fire severity risk. Is it the type of treatment method? Is it something about the particular place, like its soil depth, or is it something about the climate? What the results of our models often tell us is that things are complicated. What happens depends on the weather you get, and things about the particular location, like the subsurface, that are hard to see. So we often struggle with how do we communicate this complexity to the public? One of the things we've been doing to address that is we worked with a local artist and game designer to develop Future Mountain that takes the results from our science-based model and turns it into an interactive game that users can play. They can warm up the climate and see how this might affect the vegetation and fire in water in their particular watershed. So if you find this interesting, please visit our blog, tagteamlab.org, or feel free to reach out to me with any questions.
Hello, my name is Andrew Plantinga, and I'm a professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UCSB. I'm going to be talking about my research with Sarah Anderson and Matthew Wiebenmeyer on the question, what determines the timing and location of fuels treatments on federal lands? So we're interested in federal lands in the Western United States that are managed by agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Interior, and looking at fuels treatments like thinning and prescribed burns that you see in the photos here. These activities are designed to reduce the severity of fires and therefore to protect assets on the landscape, including, importantly, homes and other structures. We're analyzing data on the location and timing of fuels treatments on federal lands, as shown in the lower right-hand corner here, and in particular asking what determines the timing and location of these fuels treatments. The first question we wanted to investigate is what role do fires themselves play in the timing of fuels treatments? You might think that a community that has a large fire nearby would have a lower likelihood of getting fuels treatments put near it because large fires, in fact, remove a lot of fuels from the landscape and in effect are like very large fuels treatments themselves. But what we found, interestingly, is that actually having a fire nearby increased the likelihood of communities getting fuels treatments on neighboring federal lands by 1.6 percentage points, which is a 45% increase over the baseline rate of treatment. So what is going on there? Well, we hypothesize that that this has to do with risk salience. So when a fire occurs, people are thinking a lot about the risk associated with wildfires when they have a fire near their community. However, and so what they do is they go to their federal land management agency and say, we would like you to do something about this. So for example, put in fuels treatments. However, there's a misalignment or a mismatch between the salience of risk and the actual risk, because right after you've had a big wildfire, while the risk salience is high, indeed the actual risk is quite low. Over time for the community, as the time since the wildfire occurred increases, the salience of the risk goes down as they start to worry about other kinds of risks or other kinds of problems, when indeed the actual risk is increasing. The next question we asked is whether we could use the occurrence of these wildfires to learn about what types of communities these fuels treatments are placed nearby. So we compared many communities and looked at their socioeconomic characteristics. And what we found is in comparing communities along these dimensions is that if you look at communities that have a wildfire nearby, the richer and more educated and whiter communities have a larger likelihood of receiving fuels treatments in the wake of those fires compared to more vulnerable communities. So we measured a 4 percentage point increase in the likelihood of getting a fuels treatment, which was a 35% increase over the baseline rate. So what's happening in this case? Well, we have evidence that suggests that it has something to do with the ability of communities to mobilize, and particularly higher socioeconomic status communities better able to do things like form fire-wise communities, and which would then enable them to better convince federal land management agencies to put fuels treatments nearby, or better able to participate in cost share programs like the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program.
Hi, I'm Anna Trugman. I'm an assistant professor in the UC Santa Barbara Geography Department, where I've been working since 2019. And I'm an expert in forest ecology and ecological dynamics, particularly after climate and fire disturbances, and also an expert in mathematical modeling of these forest processes. And I want to take you inside some of these mathematical models so I can let you know how we can use them to help with wildfire mitigation and adaptation. And so this is a coupled wildfire vegetation model that my group works with that represents a given forested domain. So for example, we're looking at, in particular, the Sierra Nevada at this point in time. And the fire characteristics are represented on a 12-kilometer grid. And the factors that influence those fire characteristics include things like climate, but there's also a dynamic feedback between the fuels, which is where we get into the vegetation dynamic portion of the model. And that's represented on a 1-kilometer grid cell. And this enables us to represent heterogeneity in forest composition. So for example, different species types that occur on the landscape that have different biomass, so live fuels as well as down fuels and different flammabilities. And this is just a little more detailed representation of this dynamic coupling at large spatial scales between the fire characteristics and the fuels that this model produces. And so you have like fire geography, effects of aridity on fire, and this in turn impacts the different tree regenerations, growth, and mortality, which is a dynamic feedback loop between these fuels and climate that we know is so important here in California in determining these different wildfire regimes. And so we've been working across the US, honing in on this panel E on the left. You can see the different species types that are represented within the model with their different fuel characteristics that affect wildfire spread. And zooming in on the Sierra Nevada, you can see each of these different climate grid cells at scale with these yellow boxes. And within each of these yellow boxes, you can see the 1 kilometer squared resolution at which we represent the different species that are affecting the fuel coupling in the model. And one thing we're particularly excited about right now is looking at management interventions in the fuels related to treatments and how that might mitigate wildfire severity and total fire extent in areas that are highly vulnerable from a population perspective, and also forest resilience and forest grassland transitions. And so we have all of these different boundary data sets that we're using in the model related to slope, proximity to roads, and proximity to homes that we might be interested in using the model to optimize treatments to protect, as well as dynamic characteristics from the forest model that provide us biomass or fuels, as well as connectivity, which really influences fire spread. And from that, we can get model outputs. This is just one example where we look at how forest extent might change if we have a control versus treatment intervention. And this can be done for things like looking at changes in fire severity and fire extent over decadal or longer timescales, something that we wouldn't really be able to do in the duration of an experiment outside to support management decisions. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Everybody, my name is Jacob Gelman, and I am a PhD student at University of California, Santa Barbara, and this is joint work with Judd Boomhauer, Meredith Fowley, and Andrew Plantinga, and the title is Wildfire Risk Modeling and the California Insurance Market. So, big issue in California right now is that wildfires are becoming more frequent and more severe, and these are posing huge damages to the insurance industry. You can see in 2017 and 2018, huge losses among insurance companies. And how are insurance companies responding? Well, they are dropping homeowners from their policies. And a lot of the reason they're dropping people from their policies is because they are price constrained in high risk areas. So a couple of key regulations in California that constrain insurers. First of all, California is a prior approval state, so any insurance premium must be approved by the state insurance commission. But importantly, rates must be justified by company-specific historical loss experience. That means that insurance companies charge based on past realized damages rather than forward-looking expected damages. And this is a problem for wildfire because we know that damages are expected to grow in the future. Lastly, there's a binding constraint of 7% premium increases for any insurance company asking for a rate increase. We have a couple of research questions here. First, are insurance premia actuarially fair in California? And what that means is that an insurance premium should be equal to your expected losses. That is your probability of a loss times the value of your house. Next question is, do we see evidence of rate suppression in this market? I implied that insurance companies can't charge enough to high-risk customers, so we want to investigate that. Also, we want to know, are homeowners in urban areas cross-subsidizing homeowners in high-risk areas? So our approach is we're going to compare offered homeowners insurance prices to physical measures of fire hazard. We're going to use 3 data sets for this. First of all, we look at public insurance rate filings by insurance companies. So these are all available online, and you can reconstruct insurance prices for any company. We're going to combine that with housing data from Zillow, as well as fire hazard data from the Forest Service. So here's a map of a representative house. If you were to take the same house and move it around in the state, how much State Farm would charge that customer for their homeowner's insurance policy. This is a map of fire hazard in California, and the measure is called a risk to potential structure. So roughly, it's the probability that a house would be destroyed by a wildfire in any given year in percentage terms. So our empirical approach is we're going to run a linear regression for a house, and these are real houses in California, where the left-hand side is the premium that it would be offered, comparing to the expected loss on the right-hand side. And the question is, do premia rise one-to-one with expected losses? And does this vary by fire hazard? So when we run this regression for different bins of fire hazard as measured by the Forest Service, we find that at low levels, insurance premia rise faster with risk, and at high levels of risk, insurance premia rise slower with risk. And if there were actuarially fair insurance, we would expect that premia rise one-to-one, and that's not what we find. So a few observations. Above 0.2% probability of parcel destruction, premia no longer rise one-to-one with fire hazard. And when the annual probability of parcel destruction exceeds 0.4%, insurance premia do not cover expected losses under current price levels. This applies to more than 370,000 single-family homes in California, and the replacement cost of these homes is over $120 billion. We also find that homes in low hazard areas appear to cross-subsidize homes in high hazard areas, as manifested through insurance premia. That's all I have, and thanks for attending my flash talk.
Hello, I'm Leila Carvalho, climate science professor in the Department of Geography, UC Santa Barbara. Today, I'm going to talk about sundowners, fire weather in Santa Barbara, and the Sundowner Winds experiment, SWEX. To have lived in Santa Barbara for more than 2 years, you probably have seen a significant wildfire somewhere in the slopes of the San Ynez Mountains. Yes, Santa Barbara is a fire-prone region. What these wildfires have in common? Well, they have all been enhanced by strong winds in the southern slopes of the San Ynez Mountains, known as sundowner winds or sundowners. Sundowner winds are gusty winds blowing from the southern slopes of the San Ynez Mountains towards the coast. Typically, they peak from late afternoon to early morning. They cause relatively warm evenings and significant drop in humidity. They are considered the most important fire weather conditions in Santa Barbara. They occur year-round, but are more frequent during spring, from March through May. To give an example of how complex these winds are, I'm showing a model simulation of winds at 6 p.m. during the Resuscita fire in 2009. Arrows indicate wind direction, and the magnitude of the winds is shown by the size of the arrow. Colors indicate relative humidity, with red colors showing drier conditions. Notice how much winds vary in direction and intensity across the southern mountain slopes. They usually exhibit a northwest direction in the west and northeast direction in the eastern slopes of the San Ynez Mountains. Note also the dramatic variability in relative humidity. Usually, drier conditions are observed in the eastern portion of the domain, where more people live. Thus, it is important to properly predict wind intensity and direction over time and where these winds are going to be stronger, particularly if we have a wildfire. The Sundown Winds Experiment is a collaborative project supported by the National Science Foundation to investigate sundown winds. It results from a collaboration of 9 institutions from all over the country, including the UC Santa Barbara, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Naval Postgraduate School, San Jose State University, University of Virginia, SUNY Albany, University of Notre Dame, Jackson State University, University of Colorado, Boulder. It counts with a strong logistic support of the National Weather Service and the Santa Barbara County Fire Department and U.S. Forest Service. The SWEX experiment will extend from April 1st to May 15, 2022. Goals of these projects is to integrate multiple sophisticated instrumental platforms to 1. Better understand mechanisms driving the spatial and temporal variability of sundowners, improve model forecasts of sundowner winds and extreme fire weather conditions, strong winds and low humidity, transfer our scientific results to the National Weather Service and the Santa Barbara and Montecito Fire Departments, contributing to a more accurate forecast of conditions leading to extreme and fast wildfire spread risks. Finally, educate the local community about wildfire risks in the Santa Barbara County. During 45 days of the experiment, we will have 19 stations placed in several locations in the San Ynez Mountains and San Rafael Mountains, the red symbols, plus 6 lidars and 3 wind profilers that use remote sensing to quantify profiles of wind speed, direction, and turbulence. These instruments are placed in public land and private property. Some of these properties belong to the Santa Barbara County Fire Department. They are placed in key locations in the coast and in the San Ynez Valley, Sedgwick Reserve, San Ynez Airport, and Rancho Alegre. We also have mobile platforms such as the Naval Postgraduate School Twin Otter, equipped with sophisticated lidars that are capable to evaluate profiles of temperature, humidity, winds, and aerosols. They will help us to understand what happens with these profiles across the mountains, along the valley, and the Santa Barbara Channel. We also have the Jackson State University Meteorological Unit mounted on a car that can measure near ground temperature and humidity. The University of Virginia mobile lidar is utilized to evaluate profiles of winds as the car drives along the roads. We also launch weather balloons from 4 sites, coast and valley, with sounds that go above 32,000 feet, measuring profiles of temperature, humidity, and winds. Here's an example showing how we integrate airplane, mobile measurements, and radio sounds in the red dots. So we can see as the airplane flies, cars will move, radio sounds will launch balloons, and then we will integrate all this information. Cool, huh? To finish, I'm providing one quick result showing what the mobile lidar observed and was traveling along the 101 during a sundowner event. What you see on the left panel is a profile of wind speed, and on the right panel, a profile of wind direction. When the car was passing across West Goleta, it registered less than 5 miles per hour wind with southeast direction below 1,000 meters at 6 PDT. As the car moves west and passes across Arroyo Rondo, 1 hour later, winds increase to 50 miles per hour at elevations less than 100 meters. This is how dramatically winds can change in space during sundowner events. This also illustrates how important it is to have a good forecast of these winds. Measurements are necessary to validate these forecasts. We'll have much more to share in the future, so thank you for your attention.
Well, hello. My name is Max Moritz. I'm a UC Cooperative Extension Specialist in Wildfire, and I'm located here at UCSB in the Bren School and also affiliated with the Earth Research Institute. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the regional wildfire mitigation program that we've started here in Santa Barbara. It's basically to alleviate and minimize the impacts that wildfire has on our communities. Some graphic examples of that here. For new communities, there are a lot of options, or a lot more options, for making survivable communities. There's some guidance that we have put together for that. I'm showing you here a recent publication. But for the many, many, many thousands of communities, millions of people that are already built and living on fire-prone landscapes, what do we do? And one of the things that we have started here as a step in that direction is the Regional Wildfire Mitigation Program. It's built on 3 domains of resilience. Basically, one is the built environment, identifying how to mitigate the risks there. The landscape, how to buffer the communities so that fire doesn't come out of the wildlands and into the built environment and where the people are. And the community itself, the people, training and education. The most common tool is a community wildfire protection plan, which is a longstanding and effective way to identify and prioritize where you would want to have fuel breaks on your landscape. We probably have 5 or 6 of them in our front country here. But community wildfire protection plans are kind of disjunct, not working together necessarily. They're not integrated. And so they also don't deal with the 3 domains of risks that we saw in the previous slide. They're really for prioritizing fuel breaks. How are we going to do that here locally? Well, we're going to map and quantify the risk and the potential advantages of things like shaded fuel breaks in the landscape domain, habitat restoration, green belts, riparian areas, and ag buffers that we might want to preserve because they actually provide that buffering function. In the built environment, home hardening, obviously, but also other infrastructure, water supplies, road networks, and so on. And in the community domain, really focusing on education and training for FireWise USA, getting these communities plugged in and recognized, and the advantages that come with that. How's this going to happen? Well, there's 3 phases. We're in the scoping phase now. A lot of mapping and modeling of the hazard and the exposure of the assets that are at risk, and how to mitigate those risks, how to prioritize what to do where. And then once that's done, a strategic implementation plan will come from that, and the implementation phase will happen actually doing those mitigation activities in the 3 domains, and then monitoring at the end. So all of this will be providing a series of mapped data sets, a series of web-based tools for the Fire Safe Council and agencies and homeowners to plug into and to see how the RWMP is progressing and how they can become active in it. I urge you to go to the website itself, rwmpsantabarbara.org. We're hoping that this is just the pilot phase and that we export this to other communities across the Western US. You can also contact the director, Graham Wazalewski, at the email there at the end. Many, many partners here locally and beyond. And thank you for your time and attention.